there's a little letter in your New Testament from the Apostle Paul to the Galatians. I was interested in discovering a year or so ago in a bit of research that they were in fact Irish. The Galatians, the Gauls, who drifted across Europe until they finally got to the Emerald Isle. But at least when he's writing to them, they're in the middle of what is present-day Turkey. And at one point he says this to them: the evidence of the Spirit in your life is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Against these there is no law. And those who belong to Jesus have crucified the old nature with its passions and desires. If the Spirit is the source of our life, let the Spirit also direct the course of our life. You know, there's been a sea change in matters of the Spirit in past decades. Both secular and religious observers agree on this. Whereas 20 or 30 years ago, it wasn't uncommon to hear somebody say, well, I belong to X church, but I'm not very religious. Now the tendency is for people to say, I'm not interested in organized religion, but I'm quite spiritual. Even the New Yorker magazine has caught the drift. Cartoon with a couple of guys walking down the street, and one saying to the other, I don't think I'm ready for organized religion. My thoughts on the subject are still very unorganized. It's certainly true on the university campus, where only 10% of students retain any ties to a religious community. 3 professors, Indiana U, the University of Northern Iowa, and the University of Wyoming, have set out to study 4 universities, interviewing faculty and students, attending classes in campus religious organizations. And the result of their research is really summed up, they say, by the student government president, one of them, who when asked whether he thought students were religious, answered, no. But most of them are very spiritual. Interesting, but what on earth does it mean? During a weekly meeting of the Wesley Foundation, the leader asks this: how can we keep the spark of God burning inside us this week? And the responses from the students included, I'm a vegetarian and that's my religion. Another one said, smile more often. Another student calls herself a spiritual junkie, citing as an example of her religious experience, turning out the lights in the room with a male friend and listening to an Indigo Girls CD, whoever they are. Not religious, but very spiritual. I suppose we might dismiss this as part of the craziness and experimentation of the college years if it didn't appear to be a growing phenomenon in the larger culture. Robert Withnow, who's a sociologist at Princeton, has been studying America's religions and religiosity for a long time, and he's convinced that Americans today are less traditionally religious, but at the same time, in rather individualistic and private ways, quite spiritual. That is, Americans traditionally settled in communities where they did not stray very far, and indeed the place where they knew God best was in the local congregation. His research now indicates that contact with the sacred has become, for many Americans, much more fluid and portable, more likely to be found in the God within us or in the angel at our side than in the stodgy old church down on the corner. Unfortunately, he comments, this spirituality is often little more than dabbling in different spiritual practices, if not downright silliness. But this move toward a highly individualistic and above all private approach to religious experience is reflected out there in a number of ways, especially in the decline in association in this country. Robert Putnam of Harvard University created a bit of a stir some time ago with his volume called Bowling Alone. In his continuing study, he has discovered that for most of the 20th century, year by year, Americans were joining more and more. PTA membership was rising, Scout membership rose, the membership in the Kiwanis Club was rising, church attendance was rising, the number of folks voting was going up, and then without warning, in the late 60s and early 70s, all these trends suddenly turned around. There's been a drop of 25 to 30% in election turnouts. There's been a drop of about 50% in membership in all sorts of organizations, PTA, Elks, Kiwanis, League of Women Voters, Scouts, and above all, the church. Someone has commented that Americans seem a people bound together now only by a belief in their inalienable right not to be bound together. Barbara Wheeler, president of Auburn Theological Seminary, New York City, laments that we North Americans not only bowl alone, but increasingly search for God alone, without joining any organized faith community. Less than half of the more than 90% of Americans who claim they believe in God attend any religious services whatever. And some enterprising researchers who've heard over the years the Gallup figures that, if you go out and ask Americans, a representative sample, as Gallup does, if they were in church last Sunday, 40% say they were. These fellows decided they'd go out and count them. And they did this in about 6 representative communities in Ohio, urban, country, suburban, and guess what they discovered? The real figure is 20% were in church last Sunday, which is to say only 20% of all Americans attend worship regularly. Several years ago, some other sociologists out in California wrote a book called Habits of the Heart, in which they quoted a young Californian nurse named Sheila, who's become a poster child for all those, 4 out of 5 Americans, for whom religious faith is a strictly private matter. She said, I believe in God, I'm not a religious fanatic, I can't remember the last time I went to church, as if going to church indicated a measure of fanaticism. But my faith has carried me a long way. I call it Sheilaism, just my own little voice. So listening to the preaching of one's own little voice threatens to become the dominant religious pattern in this society. Which leads to the conclusion that the fact that you are here this morning makes you quite countercultural, if I may say so. These days, meeting regularly with others to listen and talk and think about God is a minority activity. Now, I must tell you that, excuse me, early in my ministry, I felt very uneasy about trying to sell church. It seemed rather self-serving. After all, if everybody in Blue Earth, Minnesota decided not to come, where would I be? No longer in Blue Earth, Minnesota, that's for sure. But I've gotten over that for several reasons. First of all, I came to realize that church is not, in the last analysis, institutions, stained glass, pews, organs, hymnals, formal clothing, candles, robes, crosses, even hierarchy. As important as these at times may be, these are not what it's all about. What it's all about is community. Dog-eared, misused word out there. The economic community, are you kidding? But it is about community. Secondly, it's not just clergy who are worrying about the church these days, it is the scientists, the sociologists. They point out that social networks have amazing power. In fact, the power of social networks is a remarkable discovery of social science in the last couple of decades. People who are connected with other people live longer and are healthier. In communities where people are connected, really connected, schools work better, the crime rate is lower. And the church, as a central social network, offers its members better health, more stable marriages, more successful child rearing, and longer lives, no less. They tell you, not I, that if you keep showing up here Sunday after Sunday, you will show up everywhere 10 years longer than those who don't. So probably the healthiest thing you've done this week is... So retreat into a kind of private relationship with a private deity may not so much be wrong. Some people manage it, I'm sure, as it is dangerous, risky, where people tend to retreat more and more into a private spirituality which may afford a measure of inner equilibrium and solace. They also tend to lose touch with identity, commitments, accountability, the larger purposes which make for real life. Jean Bethke Elshtain, whom we had out a while ago, ethicist down at the University of Chicago, talks about the kind of self that seems to be developing out there that has accompanied what she calls the triumph of the therapeutic culture, a quivering sentimental self, she calls it, that gets uncomfortable very quickly because this self has to feel good about itself all the time. And being with others is not necessarily conducive to feeling good all the time. Forgive me for quoting so many observers of the current scene, but the consistency is remarkable. Alistair MacIntyre is a very well-known professor in academic circles. He's down at Notre Dame. He argues that the modern self possesses a certain ghostly character, disconnected as it is from that which could define it. In many pre-modern or traditional societies, it is through his or her membership in a variety of social groups that the individual identifies himself or herself and is identified by others. I am a brother, cousin, grandson, member of this household, that village, this tribe, that church. And there was no escaping this elemental identity. I was born with a past, and to try and cut myself off from that past in the individualist mode is to deform even my present relationships. And these are not characteristics that belong to human beings accidentally, to be stripped away in order to discover the real me. In reality, there is no such thing as the isolated, autonomous, independent individual, which is what is at stake when it comes to the future of the Christian church and community. George Weigel paints a picture for us. Go back in your mind's eye to the fall of 1940. At least half of you can probably do that. The fateful period that Winston Churchill called Britain's finest hour. Hermann Goering had convinced Hitler that that Britain could be bludgeoned into submission on the cheap, so the Luftwaffe unleashed a fierce aerial blitz. One of the most famous photographs from these desperate weeks was a nocturnal silhouette of St. Paul's Cathedral, its great dome standing strong and unshaken above the smoke and fire swirling through London. That grainy photograph stirs the emotions to this very day. Perhaps you've seen it, because it captures in one brilliant image the struggle of Western Christian civilization against the barbarism that seemed on the verge of overwhelming it. Now turn your mind's eye 2 generations forward. About 45 years after the Blitz, Mikhail Gorbachev, then the newly chosen secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, visited London on one of his first trips abroad. As part of the hospitality extended to Gorbachev and his party, they were taken to visit St. Paul's Cathedral. After touring Sir Christopher Wren's masterpiece, Gorbachev turned to a cathedral official and said, "A most interesting building. What is it used for?" To which the man replied, "In order, sir, to worship God." Weigel goes on, "A decade later, I was in London to lecture and look up a young Czech seminarian who'd been very helpful when I was doing research on the role of the Christian community in the collapse of communism. He mentioned that he had not yet visited St. Paul, so we took the tube to the city and went to the cathedral. To my surprise, I discovered that except on Sunday morning when there was worship, one could no longer enter St. Paul's without paying a considerable entrance fee. On a Saturday afternoon in January 1995, it had been turned really into a museum. The church in England has almost ceased to be a community of the committed. But 3% of the population of the British Isles are together in any given week. I pray God this is not a harbinger of something moving west. In the biblical world of 2,000 years ago, the experience of God was bound up with the experience of community, and not casual community either, but committed, accountable, caring community. A community shaped not just by any spirit, but by the Spirit of Jesus. A spirit of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. If you think of it, all social graces in the most profound sense of those words. Jesus, who the night before he died insisted on breaking bread, with those around him. Jesus, who said, "Where 2 or 3 are gathered, there am I also." The Spirit of God present in Jesus is not experienced truly outside the context of our life together. We've largely lost the context of that famous chapter that Elizabeth read, a chapter that shows up at marriages almost to the point of boredom. The love of 1 Corinthians has very little to do with next Saturday. If you don't know what next Saturday is about, gentlemen, you better ask your wife or girlfriend while you have time. It has to do with a congregation, an important congregation, a strategic congregation that is breaking apart over the issue as to who is the most spiritual. Those who can preach with the greatest eloquence, and everybody was preaching in those days, or those who lost it in strange ecstasy on Sunday morning. It is to a Christian community threatened with collapse that he writes to say, "I don't care if you bang on a drum, are as smart as a whip, are fanatic enough to go to the stake for your faith. If you don't have the spirit of love that is willing to bear with one another, endure one another, you're nothing." Community is crucial because it's there that we meet Jesus as a gift and as demand, caring for and bearing with one another. Because there'll be times when we all need that kind of community. And even when those times are not now for you or me, when we happen to be sailing along pretty strong, the community nevertheless needs us. There's a story of a New England church, true story. Not long ago, the minister opened the service by expressing his horror at an incident that had made newspaper headlines: the brutal assault of a woman in the city park. He announced that the victim was in fact a deacon in that congregation and had been mailing cards to homebound church members when the crime occurred. He named the woman, and she came forward slowly, said she'd ask for the privilege of saying a few words. She said simply that as she had endured the assault, she felt that her fellow church members were with her, bearing her up, and she just wanted to thank God for you all. At the most terrible moment of her life, when God must have seemed very far away, trust in God was possible because she knew that others, including those whose cards she held in her hand, were believing, trusting, and loving God for her until she would be strong enough to do it again for herself and then for them. And there are many in this congregation going through troubled waters and tough challenges this very day who bear the same witness. I could not manage this if it were not for your thoughts and your presence and your prayers. Spirituality? Yes, if it leads to commitment to community, to life together. And yes, if it leads to service in the world beyond the community in which we live, church, neighborhood, workplace, country. In the biblical faith, the experience of the presence of the Spirit of God is bound up also with service beyond self. He said, "Inasmuch as you've done it to these, you've done it to me." And the research here, by the way, and there is some now, is interesting. The person involved in a religious community is also more likely to be involved than his secular counterpart in the life of the civic community, in political activity, for example. Likely to be more involved in PTA or United Way, more likely to volunteer in secular settings all the way from the hospital to soup kitchens. And broadly speaking, this is more true of mainline churches like our own than it is the fundamentalists. If spirituality means sensitivity to the Spirit of Jesus, we're both gathered together and sent out to serve. Sue Ontiferos, who's a columnist in the Sun-Times, last October told the story of a couple who built a hugely successful vineyard in California. Now they use immense amounts of the profits to help people in need around the world. They flew in Chicago last October, where the husband took time out to visit a classroom. He was visiting these students with a group he works with in Chicago called Working in the Schools, a tutoring and mentoring program. He first met the class back in the 4th grade. Photos and letters and money and visits have flowed back and forth over these 4 years. When he talked, the students listened. Not a sound from them, and remember, these were teenagers. He told them of the promise that he had learned to see in them over the years. To me, you are living illustrations of the future, of opportunity. But this time, he wanted to make sure of something else, that they knew that giving is a two-way street. When he and his wife began what was to become their life's work, they knew what they did would be helping others. But then they discovered something else as they went along. We went here to help you, and you have helped us immensely more. What he learned was that when one gives to others, wherever, one gets back an almost indescribable joy from time to time. It opens the doors to the goodness in others. It's something that money can't buy. He concluded by telling his young friends, you see, happiness is an inside job. And so it is. But the opportunities for serving are all over the place, aren't they? Many of you know that and are involved in it, and I trust find some joy in it. These two are what call us out of our isolation and self-absorption into the kind of spirituality that we see in Jesus. His life, if you stop and think about it, was a life both with and for others. And his invitation to join him remains always open. Love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, self-control. It's not a bad spirit to let get hold of you.